Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of our Thrive in China Roundtable. If you have just joined us, this is your first roundtable. Allow me to explain a little bit about the roundtables and the concepts. Basically, we have a weekly roundtable every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Central European Time, where we touch on a variety of different topics related to doing business in both Hong Kong and China. Every week, we try to come up with certain pain points that our clients are experiencing and highlight them through discussions, PowerPoint presentations, and ultimately also a checklist of actionable points that you can then do at a later stage. If you're not aware of who we are, Woodburn Accountants and Advisors is one of China and Hong Kong's most trusted business setup and corporate administration advisory firms. We are headquartered in Hong Kong and we have our subsidiary in Shanghai. We focus 100% on inbound investment into China and Hong Kong. We offer a variety of different services related to pre-investment advisory, all the way through to trademark applications, company registrations, accounting, tax, payroll, corporate governance services, basically all the administrative services that are related to maintaining a structure in both Hong Kong and China. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christina Kohler-Kalucha. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I have been doing this job for over 20 years now, purely focused on the mainland Chinese market, working with over 750 different companies, variety of different sectors and industries on their market entry and growth and scaling in the Chinese market. Today, on today's roundtable, we're going to be talking about one of the hottest pain points that companies in China struggle with, and that is determining the amount of capital you need to start up your China venture. The reason why I consider this one of the largest pain points is that, from my perspective, you can be a company that has over 100 years of history. However, if you are starting your market entry into China, you are just like everybody else. You are a startup who needs capital to fund up this venture that you are going on. And the pain point really is that companies don't calculate enough funds to start up their ventures. Sometimes they are over optimistic. Most of the time, their forecasts are bright and beautiful, like rainbows with twinkly stars. And the reality of the situation is that that's not the reality, is that you burn cash very quickly, you run out of cash very quickly, and then you struggle to figure out where you're getting cash from. So today's roundtable is really actually a checklist, and I will be repeating myself consistently throughout the variety of checklists to highlight what you need to consider when you are calculating your startup funds. There is no magic number. It really comes down to the industry you're in, the sector you're in, and how quickly you plan on growing and scaling. A company that starts off in China with only one employee is going to have a very different budget than a company that starts up in China with 10 employees. So there is no magic number. It really comes down to how much financial resources you have, whether you're starting slow and steady or whether you are diving into the deep end of your Chinese venture. There are going to be a variety of different considerations that you have to look at. And the point of today's presentations is that you understand what those key aspects are and that you are incorporating them into your budget. Now, I want to start off with an essential guide, if you will, for entrepreneurs and businesses who are looking to launch in China, and most importantly, who are looking to become sustainable in China. Now, all of the items that I'm talking about right now in terms of this guide are costs that you are going to incorporate prior to having that entity and that structure in China, okay? So the first thing that we're going to be looking at is market research, right? You need to understand what the landscape looks like, consumer behaviorism, maybe do a competitor benchmarking, looking at your specific industry and sector and what is the regulatory environment. You might be looking at different business models, what your potential revenue streams are, and obviously what are your costs. That's all under market research. And there is a cost component to that research, whether you do that in-house and you utilize in-house resources to do it, or whether you go to external parties who are then going to fulfill these services for you. There will be a cost component. The next one is the business plan, and obviously putting together this strategy that is not only a beautiful PowerPoint presentation, but also includes financial projections, forecasting, revenue models, marketing projections, etc. So this business plan is ultimately going to be your roadmap, if you will, on the startup costs and the ongoing expenses. And in the further chapters that we're going to talk about today, all of those points that I'm going to discuss should be then included within this business plan. The legal and regulatory compliance, we will go into more details on this, but obviously you have to think, do you need an entity or not? If you're not going to have an entity, what third parties are you going to outsource certain functions to? There's going to be a cost component to that. If you are going to set up an entity, have you thought about incorporation costs, additional licensing costs, depending on the industry and sector you are in, product registrations, IP registrations? What is the cost around all of that? Not to mention then also the ongoing administration work, whether you bring that in-house or whether you decide to outsource on that. So again, looking at the cost structure, right? You're looking at the initial investment, product development, marketing, advertising, and again, we're going to go in greater detail later on in the presentation. Financial projections are all about estimating your revenue and your expenses over the initial startup phase. And now I think this is a critical point to start on, is how long is that going to be for? How long do you project your startup phase to be? Is it going to be months? Is it going to be years? My general trend over the last 20 years of doing this is that generally companies need between 3 to 5 years until they break even. I'm generalizing now, okay? If, for example, you are already transacting with China and the deal is just to convert those transactions under your Chinese company, that can happen overnight if you are extremely organized and you do the timing properly, then actually you could be generating revenue and profitability immediately. And the question is, are you going to do that, and what's your timeline on that? Understanding what your initial startup phase is going to be and how long that is going to be for is critical, okay? Because that also then defines how much startup funding you actually need. Where are you going to get the money from is another aspect. If you're an entrepreneur, are you going to fund it yourself? Are you going to find other investors, venture capitalists? Are you going to do crowdfunding? Are you going to apply for Chinese government grants or subsidies? Are you going to formulate a joint venture where actually you bring in the knowledge and the partner brings in the cash? How are you actually going to fund this investment? Then things that people don't necessarily think about are risk management, financial management, and adaptability and flexibility. Risk management, I mean, I'm going to use COVID as an example for all of this. COVID was not something anybody could have predicted, but do you have in your bank balance enough cash to sustain the operations in case of a crisis? Do you have enough financial sustainability to be able to go over these crisis moments that may occur? Thinking about financial management, again, the Chinese financial management system is different from the Western world, right? Are you prepared to look at ERP systems? Are you prepared to analyze the data that you're going to be receiving from the various parties? If you outsource, then obviously these outsource providers will have these tools readily available. If you're not, or you're inclined to want to have control, you might then invest in these software systems and in these financial tools. Adaptability and flexibility is all about changing to the market conditions. And again, we didn't see this, we saw this really occurring during COVID, where everybody had to pivot their business, look for new revenue line items, and, you know, be agile in terms of downsizing, upscaling. I mean, everybody was in a different direction in terms of going into China. What you all have to realize is that you do need to localize your business in some shape or form. So the first way you have to adapt is localize. Once you've localized, it's then also just pivoting in moments that you have to think about. The next point I want to highlight, sorry, the slides are changing very slowly. 1 second, there we go, is network and partnerships, right? Don't underestimate the time resources involved and potentially the financial resources involved in building relationships with third parties locally in China. These third parties can be anything from chambers of commerce to potential joint venture partners to potential investors. It can really vary. So making sure that you have all of these aspects securely thought about will be critical. So let's start off with the first chapter that I want to go through today, which is market analysis and entry costs. So when we are looking at market analysis, again, this is kind of the research that you have to go into. And you have to decide whether it makes sense for you to actually pay for this. I have a lot of clients who don't do this in-depth market analysis, and they definitely struggle in terms of adaptability and flexibility to pivot their business in either moments of crisis or where there is a competitive pressure building up on them. So when you're thinking about market analysis, do think about market size and growth. What is the competitive landscape? Just for your reference, I do a benchmarking exercise every 24 months to analyze my competitors. Have they merged? Are there fewer on the market? Are there more in the market? What do their pricings look like? How are they catering to clients in China? Have they changed revenue streams? Have they added revenue streams? Have they eliminated revenue streams? We go into an in-depth analysis to then understand where our niche is. And I do this every 2 years, okay? I have to stay on top of the market. I just got off a podcast recording with a digital marketeer, a KOL influencer, and he highlighted how one of the biggest issues with foreign brands coming into China or foreign investors going into China is the fact that they don't adapt to the speed of doing business in China. And because they're not adapting to the speed in the way that China does business and the way how quickly decisions are being made, they lose out compared to their competitors who are quicker in making decisions. How can you make decisions if you don't have data at your fingertips to be able to analyze in which direction you should be going into? The next is looking at consumer insights. Focus groups are key. I know a lot of brands that have had to pivot their products alone in terms of changing packaging, changing ingredients, because they were looking at product registrations and the guidelines on that, getting feedback from consumers on what they thought was good and not good about the products and the packaging. Looking at the regulatory environment. Cross-border e-commerce at the moment for brands is a huge way of getting into the market without doing a lot of the regulatory registrations. However, if you are growing at a certain size and scale, at what point do you decide that, no, we have to sit down now and actually do our product registrations and become a domestic business, again, to beat out our competitors, get ahead of the game, and find, again, new sales channels and new revenue streams, all right? So cross-border e-commerce is all well and good as a starting point, but at some point you have to look at those triggers and understand, when are we going to actually get settled into the market? So when you are looking at market analysis, please do look at these 4 different types of components. And remember, there is a cost associated with being able to get the information and data in relation to all of this. Entry costs. Market entry strategy. Now, everybody has a different risk appetite, commitment level, and financial resource level. And obviously, it's really important to understand what business models exist, what options you have available to you. It's a matter of then researching what those options are and understanding what you want to do and what fits your business. Deciding whether you are just going to use a distributor, only use a TP, perhaps sign a licensing agreement, maybe go the franchise direction, maybe formulate a partnership in the form of a JV, or actually set up your own structure on the ground. All of these different options will have different pricing connotations, but they will also have different connotations in terms of your time resources and whether you want to have control within your business or whether you want to delegate your business in China. So again, analyzing all of these different options, what are the cost components associated with these variety of different business models? When companies are going the distribution route and they are working with wholesale distributors, looking at the commissions that are being earned, or if you're giving full control over to them, understanding what the end pricing is that they're charging so you understand what they're earning, can be a trigger for you to say, actually, I want to eliminate them. They're earning way too much. We can actually earn that margin in our own business in China, right? You've got to analyze these things consistently throughout the journey of your Chinese organization. The legal and regulatory compliance, I have a full chapter just solely on this, but again, this is part of the entry costs because it is part of the entry strategy, right? Are you going to work with law firms? Do you need to work with law firms? Are you going to work with incorporation agents? If you're working with distributors, maybe you only need the law firms to review contracts. Do you understand what the regulations are in terms of product registrations? How much does that cost? How long does that take? What are customs regulations if we're importing goods into China? Who is liable for that cost if we don't have our own entity? Is it the distributor? Who takes responsibility for what in terms of legal compliance aspects along the supply chain? These are, again, things that you have to look at. Intellectual property, again, is something that is definitely not put on people's priority lists. It's probably the cheapest item in all of this and the easiest to do, and people still tend not to get it done. Please allocate funds for IP protection, and that includes everything from registering your brand assets to also thinking about patents, copyrights. And then, most importantly, if you are a brand that is selling on the e-commerce marketplaces, what about enforcement against infringement? If you find hijackers or let's just say bad people that have taken your brand and are reselling it, are you going to enforce it? Or is it just a matter that you now know who they are? It costs money to enforce. You need to get a company who's going to then hire the police to go out and catch these infringers. All right. If you want to be fully protected in the market, you need to have a monitoring system in place and an enforcement system in place. And again, a lot of these things are not necessarily cheap, but they will help you to protect your brand. Localization and adaptation. If you are in the electronic sector, you have to get 3C certification. That registration alone can take about a year to get done. I was talking with a pizza oven company out of Scotland, and they have different types of pizza ovens, and they know that the one that's going to work perfectly for the Chinese market is a gas-oriented pizza oven. They need to go through a product registration process, which already they're 8 months into it before they can even start selling the market, let alone marketing it, okay? So understand how you're going to localize your products so that you can sell locally. Understand what the consumer regulations are in case of issues related to your products. People always think about the first step, let's sell, and they forget to think about the after sales aspect. So make sure you understand what those regulations look like. I had a chocolate company, this example always comes up to my head, where they did a focus group study in China, and the packaging was not to any consumer's taste. And they had to go back to the drawing board and create a new packaging design purely for the Chinese market. So again, doing these focus groups as part of your market research study will help you to localize and adapt your products, your services, your marketing initiatives. And don't forget the customer support and after sales aspects as well. Distribution and logistics. If you are going through these methodologies of sales channels, understanding how much control you want your distributor to have or your sales representative to have, what warehousing is being used, transportation, what is the infrastructure. Even if you go and visit the warehousing facilities of your distributors, make sure those are the actual facilities that are going to be utilized for your products. I have had clients who have been conned, being promised that they're going to have one warehouse for their products. Space is then limited, and their products end up in a location that is not temperature controlled, and where the products get destroyed. So make sure you're also following up on this. And if you decide that you want control over the warehousing and logistics and transportation, well, then it's up to you to find logistics providers, compare costs, and incorporate that into your cost of goods, obviously. Marketing and promotion. I've had a whole bunch of guests on my podcast, from marketeers to digital marketing agencies to PR agencies, trying to get that magic number of what is the right amount for marketing and promotion. There never is, because again, it really depends on the company, the sector that you're in, and the resources that you have. But do not underestimate the amount of promotion and marketing that has to happen in order for you to get a return on investment. You should be splitting out the marketing and promotion into a variety of different line items, everywhere from traditional advertising to digital marketing to social media campaigns, even breaking that further down into understanding the different platforms, and then obviously doing offline marketing. Talking to one of my guests today on the podcast, he highlighted how offline marketing is tremendously picking up in China now that the country is more open, in the form of trade shows, pop-up shops, industry events, markets. Do not underestimate the offline marketing as well. Everybody is focused on online because that is what we could do during COVID, being abroad. But now that everything is open, there is this, I don't want to say a complete switch, but there is an underestimation in relation to the offline events. Talent acquisition and training. So I have a lot of clients who don't consider this as part of their market entry costs, but I think it's something that you should think very highly about. Why? Distributors have their strengths and their weaknesses. They can't do everything. Or more importantly, they can't do everything well. So the question is, at what point do you feel like you need to recruit or hire or have somebody on the ground who works for you, reports to you, in order to be able to take those weaknesses and you have control over them to turn that around? A lot of distributors might not have digital marketing experience, but say they do, you don't get the traction that is required, and therefore you want to hire a brand or marketing manager who takes that over. Think about the budget for the recruitment of this individual, the hiring, training, if they need to be sent abroad to your home jurisdiction for training, and then ultimately retention. All right. These first hires are always going to be critical for your business. And so the goal is always to think, how do I retain these first hires? Then there's risk management and contingency planning. Okay. Now, obviously, this is something that every company should be looking at the moment when we look at the global environment that we are living in. I do not believe that there is a single country in the world that is doing well. Everybody is having geopolitical risks and uncertainties, and we need to be able to forecast and do some form of scenario planning just in case, right? That's from a global perspective and geopolitical perspective, but also we all know that China changes rapidly. Regulations change rapidly. The new company law has just been initiated. It's going into effect on the 1st of July, 2024, so in less than 6 months. And we need to plan for this. There are certain updates that every single company in China has to do, as well as every new company that is being registered right now. So these are challenges, but they are challenges we need to be aware of. And in our budget, we need to have a buffer for this contingency planning and risk management. The next chapter is looking at operational expenses and cultural nuances. But before we start on that, overall, conducting a thorough market analysis and carefully estimating the entry costs are really essential steps for companies that are planning to come into the Chinese market, whether it's about setting up a company or not setting up a company. I mean, you are planning to trade or offer services into the Chinese market. It is really, really important to not over dramatize your budgets. You need to have a realistic budget, a conservative budget. And this might go against the wishes of the board of directors, but to get a green light on a project based on false figures is also not good. It's only going to cause you trouble along your journey. In order to be able to think about the market entry costs and budgeting, make sure you leverage off of local expertise, not just from accountants, but from lawyers and other parties to give you that insight. Establish strategic partnerships where you can delegate a lot of the work initially. And then obviously the key component here is to constantly monitor and adjust your market entry strategy and hence your budget to capitalize on any of the opportunities that are arising, but also any of the challenges that might be coming along the way. In this new chapter, we're going to be looking at crucial considerations around operational expenses. And something that I think is left out a lot is also the cultural nuances around managing your China business from abroad. So in terms of operational expenses, the first is labor costs. China has seen a gradual increase in labor costs over the years, especially in the east coast of China and obviously in the tier 1 and tier 2 cities. Obviously, compared to Western countries, the labor costs are still relatively low. However, if you look at, and I do this just and for my own profession, if you look at the accounting industry, the wages of accountants nowadays in Shanghai are comparable to places like in Hong Kong, like in Luxembourg, where I am. So definitely they are on par to Western standards. Skill set is something we can then discuss at a later stage. I am only talking about pure numbers, okay? And when I talk about the labor costs, I'm not just talking about the gross salaries. Social insurance and housing fund is also increasing. Allowances are also being offered to employees nowadays, whether that is meal allowances, transport allowances, housing allowances, children's school allowances. These are all things that are also now being brought in even for local contracts with Chinese employees. So make sure you do a good amount of simulations when you are calculating the labor costs. One exercise I do also recommend is that if you are working with distributors, get an understanding of the labor costs from the employees of the distributor. So you have an understanding of how this might impact you if you decide to take over the business yourself and have control. Also, if you're looking for benchmarking, most of the big headhunting firms like Hayes, Michael Page, they publish salary guidelines that may also then give you insight on gross salary levels, excluding social insurance and housing funds. So just type into Google Hayes China salary guideline and you will see what that looks like. Real estate space, the cost of renting, the cost of leasing office space will vary depending on the locations in China. Major cities like Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, I would even go and say Hangzhou, Nanjing, and some of these tier 2 cities are becoming more and more expensive. China is not as cheap as it used to be. I have a client right now who's looking for warehousing space in Zhangjiagang, thinking that it would be a lot cheaper than it would be in the US, and having a shock of his life, realizing that costs are comparable. So understand that this is something you need to look into. Talk to real estate agents, understand what the marketplace looks like, compare it between tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 cities. It might be the push you need to realize that maybe not being in a tier 1 city is better, because labor costs and rental space is cheaper outside. Utilities and infrastructure, again, are something that are not generally looked at, but if you are looking at having your own warehousing space or having your own office space, it is looking at things like electricity, water, internet, phone, everything else that might be needed for whatever you're planning on doing, whether it's gas access, depending on if you're manufacturing or not. Definitely look again at service providers and at costs related to this. Now, China is a large country. There are well-developed infrastructural lines, whether it's by train, whether it's by road, whether it's by plane. But one of the biggest issues that my clients have is transparency and clarity over inventory management systems, customs duties, logistical costs. One of the biggest pain points we as accountants suffer is the delay in getting the costs from the logistical providers in terms of warehousing, transportation, etc. It is difficult. And it is a pain point. There's no one provider that does it better than the other. This is a downside to all the providers in terms of having this clarity and this transparency. Again, if you are delegating this work to your distributor, maybe this is something you don't care about for the time being. But if you are planning on building up your own business, then this is something you have to look in depth at. Compliance with local regulations as well as tax laws is going to be critical for operating your business in China. You've got to understand the tax structure. You have to understand what corporate income tax looks like, value-added tax looks like, customs duties looks like. You have to understand whether you need additional permits or licenses based on the industry and sector that you are in. There are zones in China, or exporting regions, if you will, industrial zones, where they are offering preferential treatments. What I need you all to understand is that these preferential treatments on tax are not permanent. They are temporary. And the biggest question mark is always, for how long are they temporary or not? This makes life in budgeting extremely difficult. And this is probably one of the contingency plannings that you have to do, because it could very well be from one fiscal year to the next fiscal year that your preferential treatments are revoked. And you have to then account for that in your budgets. Tech and IT infrastructure is also something that is relatively underlooked. Consider the cost of implementing and maintaining technology solutions that meet your business needs. Everybody will have different levels of business needs when it comes to IT, but do think about the hardware, the software, the cybersecurity, the IT support. And under all of that comes the big question of VPNs, and are you using the right tech tools for your China organization? Don't forget that Facebook is blocked, Google is blocked, and so anybody that does use a Gmail emailing system has to use a VPN. Marketing and advertising, again, I've already touched on this, but don't underestimate the amount of investment that has to happen in that as well, in terms of the running and ongoing operational expenses. When it comes to marketing and advertising, I use my husband as an example in this. My husband is a senior financial controller for a very large global F&B brand. And he and marketing don't get along at all. In fact, he's the enemy to the marketing team. Why? Because as a financial controller, it is his job to make sure that every marketing promotion has a return on investment. And he is the one that's allowing whether funding is being used or not. At some point, you need somebody in your company to act as that enemy, to analyze each of the marketing initiatives. Are they worthwhile? What is the return on investment that is occurring? And have somebody approve these marketing projects. You can forecast a lot of the promotions you want to do ahead of time, but at the speed and rate of business in China, there are always going to be marketing opportunities that fall on your doorstep. And the question is, do you take advantage of them or not? And you have to analyze the return on investment on those projects. And this is where you need a finance guy to do that analytical work for you. So not only do you need to invest in somebody who analyzes that, but you also need somebody to act as the enemy, to say, no, stop, we can't do this activity, or you have to cut something out from the budget in order to be able to do it. Cultural nuances, again, are an area where I think people don't necessarily budget for. And when I talk about budgeting for the cultural nuances, it's now that the borders are open, you have to budget for your trips to China. You have to budget for the face-to-face meetings, for the relationship building. You have to go and meet the owners of the businesses that you are partnering with. When there are dilemmas, red flags, issues related to supply chain, marketing, whatever the case might be, it will only be solved it will be solved much faster based on the speed of doing business in China by doing it face-to-face rather than by doing it over Zoom or Microsoft Teams. Doing business in China, although I have said that the speed of doing business is very fast, you do need to be patient. You do need to be persistent. You need to have a long-term perspective and vision. But in order to be able to do that, a lot of the issues have to be dealt with on the ground. And if you don't have the team on the ground to do it, you need to travel there yourself, or your team needs to travel there yourself to be able to do that. We got a blockage for 3 to 4 years not being able to travel to China. And I've seen in 2023, as the borders opened up, that a lot of people were still resistant about going over. Please account for this in your budgets now in 2024 and in 2025. Go back to the rhythm and the system and the routine of doing 5, 6, 7 trips a year. It doesn't have to be specifically you, but various people in your departments to solve the issues and create a smooth business environment. I think also by being on the ground, it will give a lot of insight, part of your market research studies, a lot of insight on how you can be adaptable, flexible, and pivot your business. Now, looking at the legal and compliance aspects, and here I've gone a little bit into the nitty-gritty of what to think about and how to break that down, okay? Again, legal and compliance will vary depending on the industry and the sector that you're in. It will also vary depending on the business model you choose. It will vary on where you're locating yourself in China, and it will also vary depending on the scope of business activities that you are performing locally. But first of all, think about business registration and incorporation. How much is this going to cost you? There is no magic number here. You're going to have costs from the largest law firms that could be in the 70,000 to 200,000 renminbi range. You will also have local incorporation agents who might charge only 10,000, and you'll have everything in between. You have to choose providers that are going to get the job done. Do it at the timeline that they have said they can get it done in. Setting up companies nowadays is not as long as it used to be. The pain point in the incorporation step is the bank account opening, where again, if you want to speed up the process and get things done faster, better that you fly over, or the legal representative flies over to show their passport to get all of that done. Corporate governance and compliance. Again, China is an old-fashioned administrative jurisdiction. And what I mean by that is that there is a lot of paperwork that is involved in relation to your business. Creating standard operating procedures is a key and fundamental aspect. Whether you have somebody create those for you or whether you build that in-house, it's going to require time and resources to get that done. These are all things that people become complacent of in the market entry stage. Even if you have one employee, you need to have these standard operating guidelines in place that can always be amended and adapted to. Today, I was on a call with an existing client. They still do not have a standard operating procedure in place in terms of when FAPIAs are being issued to customers. Everybody is doing it airy-fairy. There is no system in place, and it's causing havoc on the accounting, which is causing more time spent for the accountants, increasing costs, and more time spent for the accounting department in the HQ. All of these things can add cost into your business by not getting it done right from the beginning. Also, having procedures in place to understand when board meetings are going to take place, when decisions related to the company are going to be taking place, when changes in the company are going to be taking place, who's part of that decision-making process. These are all things that have to be thought about in the corporate governance and compliance aspect. And obviously, if board meetings are going to be taking place in China, which they don't have to be, but if they are, accounting for those trips in your budgets. Taxation and accounting, I already touched on. Again, all of that really depends on where you're located. I think probably the biggest key I want to highlight here is, are you outsourcing accounting and tax? Are you going to hire a finance manager or accountant to do that work for you? There are different cost components to the two. That's something that has to be analyzed on how you want to control your business. There are pros and cons to both. Obviously, I'm going to sell the outsourcing aspect to a certain extent. I think outsourcing is wonderful in the startup phase. There will come a point, though, where it doesn't make sense anymore, especially when more analytical work has to happen within the organization. Employment and labor laws are fundamental. A lot of people focus on just employment contracts. They don't look at employee handbooks. I will tell you now, in the last 12 months, we have seen more and more companies downsize. When they have let go of employees, there are more and more negotiations happening at the labor arbitration level. Employees, it's not easy to find jobs anymore. They're trying to get away with more compensation, and that leads to them going to the labor arbitration. You have to do your homework and understand the employment and labor laws in China, but also make sure you've got the paperwork there to secure your business, so you're not spending more at a later stage. Where again, you have to calculate a lot of that in your contingency planning. If you're planning, maybe not even planning, if suddenly you realize you need to let somebody go, what is that compensation amount, termination compensation amount? Are you going to have to pay extra if you want to avoid labor arbitration, etc.? So put some of that into the contingency planning. IP protection, again, is fundamental, making sure that you get those into your budgets, but also then the monitoring costs and the enforcement costs should also be considered. Regulatory compliance and licensing. This, for me, is looking at additional licenses that may be required specific to your business. I take the F&B sector. You need to get a food and beverage license to be able to trade. That is separate from your business license. If you are planning on importing electrical goods, you need to get the 3C product registrations done. If you are also importing goods into China, you also have to register, and you are the manufacturer, you also have to register yourself in a specific importing regulatory website, acting as a supplier. There are a lot of things you have to realize you have to do as part of your checklist. And if you're outsourcing this, this is an additional cost that you're going to have to consider, unless you do it on your own. Contractual agreements and dispute resolutions. Again, I have a lot of clients who draft agreements on their own without getting them checked by Chinese lawyers. Make sure you have a Chinese lawyer on hand who helps you to draft, review contractual agreements, who can also help you then in dispute resolutions, whether it's labor dispute, whether it's customer dispute, supplier dispute, whatever it might be. that you have somebody who can help you, who understands the Chinese regulations and laws. Again, this is part of the contingency planning, but make sure you have a budget in place for this dispute resolution. Compliance training and risk management, again, is something where not enough companies do enough of because they're so focused on the core activities of their business that they don't think about training and risk management. And when everybody starts up in China, they're too small that they feel like this doesn't take precedence. That's fine. If you've only got one employee, then try to incorporate that one employee into your compliance training and risk management sessions abroad. But make sure they get some form of training. They understand what your standard operating procedures and guidelines are. You want to mitigate as much risk. I have too many clients who make mistakes and they pay extremely large amounts of money to get them out of these obstacles or roadblocks. You want to avoid those so you're saving up on your budget. This may include things like workshops for your staff, training materials, like I said, management guidelines, operating guidelines, having a contact person within your organization who can help you with all of these aspects. Now, the last part I want to talk about is contingency planning and growth fund because these are things that actually most people don't consider as part of their budget, especially when they are starting up in China. And contingency planning is just something that has really become vital in the last 3 to 4 years with COVID, with the trade wars between the US and China. I can't, maybe trade war is too large of a word to talk between Australia, UK, and China, but it's there. There are a lot of issues arising everywhere. Going into China is always going to be a risk. We know this, okay? The question is how big of a threat this risk is going to be, especially as you start operating in the market. You have to do consistent assessments on your business in China, okay? Look at the geopolitical situation, look at the trade wars, look at the economic fluctuations, forex exchange, cybersecurity risks, natural disasters, supply chain disruptions. I mean, all of these things have been happening in the last 3 to 4 years. Small companies in China don't look at these things, and it does cause issues in their growth planning and their scaling up in the market. There has to be somebody who looks at your organization and assesses the risks and gives you scenario forecasts or different scenario options about what's best case, what's worst case, what's the middle ground, what seems to be really most likely to happen. Ultimately, you want somebody to analyze the threats to your organization, analyze the challenges to your organization, and say, this is how we're going to get out of those aspects. This is going to be the impact on the business, and this is how we're going to get out of it. Somebody needs to consistently look at that, okay? As part of that risk assessment and scenario analysis, you might also then want to look at whether you are financially resilient. One of the biggest things I have learned during COVID is that in China, cash is king. Although we're looking at a lot of digital payment systems, the tools are all digitalized. But ultimately, you don't have enough money in your bank account, whatever tools you're using, you are not going to succeed in China. And again, this is where I say people underestimate the amount of money that is required to start up their businesses in China. When we are looking at risk planning, mitigating the risks that are associated in China, during the Shanghai lockdowns in 2022, money was flowing out of the accounts without any revenue coming in. And if you didn't have enough of a bank balance, you couldn't pay employee salaries, you couldn't pay suppliers, you couldn't do anything. And there was no way of your overseas company bringing money in because nobody was working at the banks. And because there is an old-fashioned system of getting inbound funds in, there was no possibility of getting that money in. So we were stuck, left to our own devices to survive on the bank balances that we had. In your startup phase, if there's one tip I'm going to give you, is make sure you have a consistent reserve of 6 months worth of expenses. And if you are planning on growing and scaling in that period, make sure you're accounting for the additional funding that you need to be able to grow and scale. Okay. Payment terms have become trickier and trickier in China. People are not paying on time. And again, if this affects your financial reserves because revenue is not coming in or you've got a shortfall in revenues, this will affect your cash flow position and how you're going to be able to sustain your operation. One thing that a lot of my clients learned during COVID was diversification, looking for a new customer base, new revenue streams, negotiating with suppliers and third parties to lower their fees or at least provide better payment terms in order to free up the necessary cash needed. I gave my own clients credit systems of 6 months worth to be able to let them survive and have enough cash to then pay our own fees. I could only do that because I knew that we ourselves were in a healthy position. So it is thinking about how can you be resilient in terms of cash flow in China? How can you diversify if needed in order to be able to support that cash flow? Another item people don't think about when they start up in China is insurance coverage for every aspect of your business, whether this is in relation to director liability insurance, property insurance if you're renting a warehouse, business interruption insurance, cyber insurance, political risk insurance. These are all things that are hot topics at the moment. Now, obviously, paying for insurance is expensive. You need to weigh this against the risks and the liabilities. But as a startup, you are already in a vulnerable position. So make sure you think about whether these insurances will help you. There are plenty of insurance brokers in the tier 1 cities in China who can support you and advise you on what you might need based on your business plan, strategy, amount of employees, and types of transactions that you are performing. Communication and crisis management, I can tell you now, 0% of my clients had this for their China operations when COVID started. As a startup, you might not consider this vital. It is vital from day one of your business. Make sure you have a clear communication channel with your employees, WeChat, email, although email less so, WeChat, phone calls. Somehow people have forgotten how to make phone calls. Getting mobile numbers, getting WeChat connectivity, Zoom, Microsoft, making sure you have all the clear channels you need in case of any emergency or crisis. Today, for example, I couldn't reach one of my team members. She didn't show up on a call. I panicked. I thought something had happened to her. She wasn't picking up the phone. I did send an email. I sent her WeChat. Within 20 minutes, she had replied and saw it. So just make sure that you have ways of reaching out to people. Crisis management teams, usually these are always going to be developed when your organizations in China are larger in size and you will have a local crisis management team. But you can still have a crisis management team in your headquarters for China. Please don't underestimate that. Understand who is in that team, who is responsible for China, and make sure you got timely communication when things do arise that need to be handled. Now, growth funding, again, is critical. Everybody will scale up at a different rate and at a different period of time. Like I said, it takes on average, 3 to 5 years for a company to break even in China. When we are looking at equity financing, are we looking at a private equity? Are we looking at angel investors, venture capital? Or is the equity purely coming from your head office? They've got enough capital to be able to make that investment into China. Understand that you need to consistently update your business plan to ask for more funding if necessary. So make sure that your pitch deck is always up to date. If you are looking for new investors, that again, that pitch deck is up to date, has the most relevant and up-to-date figures and analytical data, whether it's from market research studies or your own internal analyses, that you are ready to get money either from the board of directors, Chinese investors, outside investors, whomever. Another avenue is obviously debt financing, getting bank loans, lines of credit, commercial lending. I am not a bank, all right? Yes, debt financing exists in China. Every bank will have its own terms and conditions around this. This is something, again, where you need to go out into the market and get appointments with a variety of banks, whether it's Chinese banks or foreign invested banks, to understand whether they can assist you in this. Government grants and incentives is something that's very interesting. I have had a handful of clients apply for grants and subsidies. Some of them being very, very specific. I have one client in a specific district in Ningbo who applied for a grant. It also meant that the company had to be set up in that specific district in order, first of all, to apply for the grant with no guarantee that you were going to get it. Eventually, they got it. Not a lot of money, about 1 million renminbi. It's still financing that goes into your business. I think what you need to be aware about in terms of Chinese government grants and incentives is that you have to read the fine print and understand how you can use that money and what that money should be used for. There might be terms and conditions around it. You also have to understand when you're going to get it, how long the application process is. For this company in Ningbo, I think it took 1.5 years for the application. So you have to understand all of these aspects. I have one client in Shanghai who applied for a R&D grant. In order to even apply for it, we had to completely change the whole bookkeeping system and how expenses were booked to show that they were already doing R&D in China. So that was quite a hefty exercise to do in order to redo all the books to fit this application for this grant. In the end of the day, minus the costs spent on the application for the grant, which was a couple 100,000 renminbi, they're looking to get about 750,000. Now, companies will see this money that comes into their account in different ways. They might see it as emergency funds, so as contingency planning. However, maybe they're not even allowed to keep that as contingency planning, and they have to use it for certain aspects related to the growth and scaling of their business. Strategic partnerships and joint ventures, great way again to get funding. Having investors come in, bring in their capital, bring in their expertise. They're going to have certain benefits. That's why you're collaborating together and creating this joint venture. The only thing I will say is that joint ventures are a marriage. Strategic partnerships are a marriage. They need to be nurtured. They need to be taken care of. Focus has to be placed on them. And most importantly, there has to be transparency and clarity between all parties. How do you get that transparency and clarity? It's making sure that you have visibility over the finances of the company, over the strategies of the company, and how do you get that transparency and clarity will probably cost you money. Whether you decide that that's going to be a cost of the joint venture or partnership or not is something to be looked at. But make sure that you think of those costs associated. I'll give you an example on just the joint venture. I work with 2 joint venture companies where in order to provide the transparency and clarity, we do monthly reviews on a quarterly basis of their business, highlighting areas where I don't want to use the word suspicious, where we just question it and red flag it, where then we look more in depth. And these are things that the headquarters of our client, the foreign investor, likes to look at because it just makes them feel that different aspects of the business are being looked at different points of the year. Crowdfunding and alternative financing are, again, different ways of getting capital. This is something I'm not an expert on whatsoever in terms of crowdfunding and alternative financing, but it is out there. There are online investment platforms. There are also brokerage firms that deal with this. So if that is something you're looking at, there are experts on the ground who can assist you. And then obviously IPOs and public markets are going to be generally for larger organizations in any case, but I did want the list to be complete in case that's something you're looking at. Now, again, when companies start up in China, they don't really think about contingency planning because they are there for the full excitement of getting into the market and focusing on the core activities. Please do think of having that buffer in your budgets of what's the worst that could happen in all aspects of the business, whether it's supply chain, legal and compliance, whatever it might be. Then we all want to grow in China. I mean, that's everybody's objective, is to make money in China and to grow and succeed. How are you going to grow? How are you going to be able to fund that business if you are planning to scale up? Is it going to be part of the original startup funds that you've calculated? Is it going to be further investment that comes in from different parties? These are all things that you have to look at with your head offices. This has been a really heavy topic. I know it has. And again, like I said in my intro, there is no magic number when it comes to understanding what is that amount for the startup of your venture in China. My goal today was really to give you that checklist. Have you thought of everything that needs to be put inside that budget? All the various calculations. And again, looking at your business in China in a phased approach, depending on the various business models that you are looking at as you grow. So if you do need any advice or you want to have a discussion about startup funds and starting up your business in China and what you need to look at, or any questions that you kind of want to go, because this is a bit of a sensitive topic, one-to-one with, let me know. In the email tomorrow, I'll be sending you a link to my diary. I'm happy to have a 30-minute call with you to discuss kind of where your pain points are lying and whatever questions you might have. If you do have general questions about today's presentation, just insert them into the chat box and be happy to touch on them in a couple of minutes. So you can go ahead and type them away. If you're interested on joining our Thrive in China community, we have a community of over 250, 300 people. It is business professionals in China and outside of China that are looking to gain knowledge about China. If you've got certain questions in there, or you want to do certain promotions or ask people for advice, I don't know everything. So we have lawyers on there, we've got marketeers on there, we've got HR professionals on there, and then we also have business people on there. So if you are interested in taking a look at that, my QR code is there. You can just connect with me on WeChat, type in Thrive in China, and I'll add you into the group. And then last but not least, our next 3 sessions are already listed up. So next week, we are talking about recruiting the first stars of your team. On the 6th of March, we're going to be investigating the supervisory role. And then on the 13th of March, for expatriates in China, we're going to be looking at the extension of the income tax exemption that's been posed up until 2027. So again, if you're interested, for all of these roundtable sessions, you have to register individually. So please go ahead and do that if you would like to join. No questions have popped in yet, so I assume there are none. If you do want to have that one-to-one meeting, like I said, I'll provide you the link to my diary in tomorrow's email, so stay tuned for that. Otherwise, you can just email me. I will put that into the chat box. It's Christina@woodburnglobal.com. You can also message me on info@woodburnglobal.com, or even just message me on WeChat as well, and I can help you. I want to thank you all for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.